Hey guys, Palsteron here. And today I'll talk about my League starter for 3.19, which is going to be a Poison Caustic Arrow Ballista Trickster. Alright, so big disclaimer right at the start here. This is not like my EA guide where I could test everything out before the patch comes out. This time it's a lot more mysterious because I just cannot test out Trickster. The new Trickster is not available right now, so there's not really any reason for me to try everything. What I can tell you is that I tested this build in POB. I made a lot of versions and came up with something that I'm really happy with. So that's disclaimer number one. If you want something really safe, I would still go for EA. I have a video out about EA Ballista and why it's still really good. Check out my updated guide. But if you're in for something spicy that might be a little bit more rogue, check this out. Second disclaimer, also that not only can I not play Trickster, I also do not know what they have in store for unique reworks. So this is my endgame setup, and I also have an early game setup. Just to make this clear, I know the Darkthrone can get really expensive. I have a plan without it, as well as that there is the new Covenant, which this build is going to be revolving around, and your damage will depend a lot on how rare this unique is, and I simply do not know. What I can tell you is that I have an endgame setup where I have that all planned in, but if you want to get this to the next level, you're going to have to get these uniques, and we don't know what they're doing this patch. And because of those factors, I simply cannot play the character all that much. I'm basically right now figuring out how to make leveling as smooth as possible for everybody. I'm going to put a dedicated video out, but when it comes to the build guide, this is where we're at, and let's talk about why I went with Caustic Arrow and why I went with Ballistas. But if you still want to see this build in action, I actually played this one back in, I think it was 3.17. I might have played it in 3.18, but then I was kind of like, EA is going to be the play. But nowadays, we got buffed quite a bit, so that's why I want to kind of reinvigorate this. Back then, we were Pathfinder. We're going to be Trickster this time. And just in general, the unique options are just fantastic. So if you want to kind of see how this plays out, I can also leave that link down in the description. All right, so first up, let's talk about why I went with Caustic Arrow. So Caustic Arrow, you might be confused here. We're not scaling the dot portion of this gem. The dot portion is scaling with levels. We are going Poison, and Poison wants base damage. So the number one thing I want to point out is that we do not want levels. Levels do nothing for this build. You want physical damage, and you want chaos damage, and you want a fast hitting bow. Don't mind this leveling bow right here. This is a nice stepping stone. We're going to go over the options later. The reason why I went with Caustic Arrow is because this has actually pretty crazy overlap potential. So if you can see that up there, other than the puddle that Caustic Arrow makes, so if we look at this here, you can see there's a puddle on the ground. This also has a hit portion. And when I first realized that, when I saw That's Real Nito's video, he basically made a 3.15 hardcore gauntlet version of this. I was pretty stunned because the potential is just pretty huge. You might scoff at these 63% base damage, but when you actually use the skill, you will realize all of these hits actually overlap. So if you put something like Greater Volley in this, look at the clustering. All of these will hit a single target. This is 5 arrows. And then on top of that, we're also going Ballistas, which means we also have Rain of Splinters at our disposal. So basically what's going to happen is if we take this 63% base damage and we times 7 it, all of a sudden we're looking at an insane skill. And not only that, but Greater Volley also really synergizes with this build because it has less projectile damage, and that does not affect our poison. So if we scale poison, we basically straight up get for 1 support gem 4 additional projectiles, no downside. Now, something really important you have to know about Caustic Arrow as well, and why it's so great, is not just the scaling potential, it's also that you get free Wither. So what happens on Ballista builds mostly is that you have to kind of put Withering Touch on them. And Withering Touch is not a great support, as you can see here. It doesn't really give you much damage. If I was to put that over something like a Void Manipulation, I would lose like 15% of my damage. But Caustic Arrow actually doesn't have to do that like Scourge Arrow or, for example, Tornado Shot would, because there's 2 ways to get free Wither here. Number one is the Anomalous Caustic Arrow, which gives you chance to inflict Wither for 2 seconds on hit. And there is also a Helm enchant that does the same. So if we look here, down here, there's Caustic Arrow has 20% chance to inflict Withered on hit. And with the amount of times we hit, with the overlaps we have, it is always up. Every single time on 15. So yeah, just another reason why I really like Caustic Arrow, but we will obviously be talking at the end of the video about other alternatives as well. Now you might ask why Ballistas. The simple answer is Ballistas are just too strong not to use. Whether you focus more on you casting and then the Ballistas are more of a boss thing, or the other way around, like I just really love the Ballista playstyle. So for example, if we take this here, I just really like just running through a map, doing this, everything dies behind me, right? I do this. Whereas if I had to cast myself, I would always have to stand still, right? Blink arrow maybe, and then stand still again, right? It just, Overall, I feel like it's a way cozier playstyle to just let the ballistas do the work. Also at Leaguestarter, you want to loot a lot more. A lot more things are actually expensive, so your loot filter will show more. So you just have more time to loot while your ballistas are just blasting away. That being said, we still have a self-cast setup right here, which is Mirage Archer, Greater Volley, Unbound Ailments, and Caustic Arrow. This is basically just your self-cast. Whenever you have time, you can kind of apply a little bit more damage, because why not? And once again, I cannot say this enough. Do not go for +2 levels. Your endgame bow is a Darkscorn because it has high damage, high multipliers for your poison. Before that, something like this is better than any +2 levels. +2 levels do nothing. Basically, ignore that these puddles here exist. The green things here that you see, these are the overlapping projectiles, the hit part. Everything that's on the ground is not really going to do that much damage. Next up, let's talk about Ascendancy. I chose the Trickster. There is 2 things you can do here, depending on what you want to do. Both are viable. It's Trickster or it's Pathfinder. Pathfinder just got a huge nerf to Master Surgeon. Basically, what you used to do is you stack gain charges when you're hit, but that got nerfed on flasks from 7 to 3. So now instead of you being immune whenever you get hit, it's basically a lot weaker. But overall, Pathfinder has a few things like Nature's Reprisal, which gives you a little bit of AoE, which you actually don't need for the overlaps. It's just a little bit nicer for clear, I guess. And Poison Prolif, which is one of the most overrated things in the game currently, because it does not really proliferate all the poisons. That's not how it works, unfortunately. It's not as good as Ignite Proliferation, just because we have so many small hits. But if, for example, you want to respec into something here, you can definitely do that, right? Pathfinder is, in my opinion, worse than Trickster, but it's not the end of the world. So let's talk about Trickster here. Now, number 1, we are not going for any of the evasion, energy shield stuff, and that is simply because number 1, we're ballistas, and number 2, because we're going to use the Covenant, and that means we can't really go through Escape Artist. If you look through this note, it says +1 to maximum energy shield per 6 evasion rating on armor. But the problem is our armor is already energy shield. So we basically get extremely little. We get a little bit of evasion from the helmet. That is about it. And then the other 2 options aren't really that good either. We're not really leeching. We're ballistas, right? Spellbreaker is not up all the time. Now, obviously, we do have Ghost Dance, but it just didn't seem worth it. And the 4 2-pointers that Trickster have did seem worth it. Now, first up, and the big star of Trickster is Polymath. 3% more damage for each different type of mastery you've allocated. In my case, that is 9, so I get 27% more damage, straight up, unconditional, and then I get 9% life on kill, 9% energy shield on kill, and 9% mana on kill. The first thing you have to understand about totems or ballistas and damage over time is that if your ballistas kill something with their damage over time, it's actually credited to you as a kill. So that means that this node here is absurdly good for ballistas, not only because it works, but also because we don't really have any leech. And if you've ever played EA Ballista or Toxic Rain Ballista, anything like that, you will know that recovery is usually a problem, especially during mapping. Against bosses, sure, you have your Life Flask, you have your Pantheon, it's all good, but during mapping, it can get really dicey. And I mean, 9 life on kill. We all know what happens when you take this node and you just get 2% life on kill. It's already huge. Think that times 5. Not even talking about the energy shield. Not even talking about the mana sustain, right? Just absolutely huge. Now, our second point that we take here is 1 step ahead. So this node can be a little bit confusing, so let's go for it one by one. The line down below, nearby enemies' action speed is at most 92% of base value. This doesn't mean that it completely invalidates, for example, increased attack and cast speed from enemies or movement speed. It just means that basically you can think about it like everything around you is chilled by 8%. That's not always true, but that's in the gist of it, which is pretty damn nice and also unconditional. Now, the top line here, your action speed is at least 108% of base value. Now, this one is a little bit more tricky. Number 1, this means you cannot be frozen, because freeze would imply that your action speed goes to 0, and it cannot, because this overrides it. So you're freeze immune. Against stuff like chill, for example, against stuff like slows. Now, I don't know in detail which slows it affects and which it does not, but overall, you can see this as just a straight up 8% more action speed. So you could think about this next to the slow immunity and whatnot. You could also think about this like ticking, for example, Tailwind, right? And that does not only go for your movement speed, it also goes for your totem placement time. If you see here, once I tick this off, you're also faster at placing totems, which is really nice. Now, one thing that it doesn't do, though, is increase your damage. It's basically movement speed, totem placement time, because your totems do not get affected by your action speed. Overall, this is just a huge quality of life node. Just the fact that I just had to explain to you for 1 minute all the small things that it doesn't seem like much, but overall it really adds up. One thing I want to mention, though, is that if you have Tailwind, that actually doesn't stack with this because it overwrites the at least 108%. So it doesn't stack with Tailwind, which doesn't matter at League Start because you wouldn't have Tailwind anyways. That is on very expensive boots. Now, next up, we have Swift Killer, and this gives us +2 to maximum frenzy charges and 200% increased charge duration. First up, the maximum frenzy charges are ridiculously good to pair with Snake Bites. Snake Bites can be annoying to get going, but if you're already starting off with 5 frenzy charges and you're in a region where you can basically access most of the other ones, now this one isn't really worth pathing to in my opinion, but this one is, and this one certainly is. At the end, you have like 7 frenzy charges. Snake Bite just gets incredibly good. On top of that, it's a unique, so later you'll be pretty easily able to get a curse on it, basically automating either Despair or Temporal Chains. The +2 frenzy charges also allow us easy access to Disciple of the Slaughter, getting a really good payoff for that amount of frenzy charges. Get the attack speed, get the increased damage, the movement speed, the evasion, and then we also get cannot be ignited while maximum endurance charges. I'm going to show you how we get those as well. So we're also ignite immune on top of chill and freeze, which is really cool. We're not completely chill immune, but you get the gist. So what this also means is this is another mastery, which gives us even more damage for Polymath. Also, I want to quickly talk about the 200% increased charge duration. This is actually huge quality of life, believe it or not. I know people are not really receptive. They always look at damage, they always look at defenses, but stuff like this just makes your gameplay experience way better. On this build, the way we get frenzy charges is we get it on kill down here, and on bosses, we get it from Frenzy itself. Now, the cool thing about the 200% charge duration is this is not only Frenzy charge duration, but that is already nice, right? You don't have to have your Frenzy up as much. You have way more freedom. You don't have to stand still and cast anything. That is just really smooth gameplay. But on top of that, it enables us to use something like Enduring Cry to get endurance charges, and those also last like 20+ seconds, basically making it way less clunky. And this is just in general a trend with Trickster. There's just so much quality of life here, stuff you don't really think about until you play it, and I'm sure it's going to be super fun. Now at the end here, we also took Heartstopper, and this is more of a controversial node because obviously every hardcore player who's watching this video right now is rolling their eyes, but Heartstopper is actually pretty damn good after rework, in my opinion, for softcore. Now every 10 seconds, you basically consecutively loop between taking 40% less damage from hits and taking 40% less damage from damage over time. So you might say, well, the less damage over time is not that important most of the time. It's more about the damage with hits, and that's only up half of the time. But can I remind you that one of the absolute craziest ascendancies and just effects in general is Fortify, and that gives 20% less damage taken, so half of this effect. And I understand that this is not up always, but just imagine the absolute insanity. While this is up, you're not going to die. And guess what? The less damage from damage over time can also be incredibly nice. Think about something like Corrupted Blood. You have to press your flask in time before it just degens you to death. If at that point you have the less damage taken, you have way more time to react. Also against bleeds, against stuff like Desecrated Ground, Burning Ground that are just so annoying at League Start. I think overall that this is just an absolutely amazing package that Trickster has to offer for a very comfy League Start. And the reason why this is so valuable on a build like this is you already have Ballistas. You cannot put down a Wither Totem. What obviously a lot of builds do is simply against single target, they have something like this, and then they put a Spell Totem. But you can't do that if you have Ballistas, because these count as your totems, so you're taking away from your active totems that actually deal damage. Now, just to give you a little bit of an insight on how this build plays, obviously I cannot really play because we cannot get Trickster right now. I'm here in game. I just took this as a scuffed version. We were leveling with Poisonous Concoction, and now we just kind of respec. I have a tabby on, but I only have a 4-link, Caustic Arrow, Greater Volley, Withering Touch, and Ballista. Right now, we still have to run Withering Touch because we don't have any alternate quality yet. So how does this build play like? So number one, we have our main setup, which is our Caustic Arrow Ballistas. You just put them down, you run You also have a Caustic Arrow self-cast, which is this one here. It has a Mirage Archer on, so every 4 seconds you just hit once, and your Mirage Archer helps your totems out. Now we also have Frenzy. Basically what we did here is Frenzy GMP, just so we can spread it a little bit better. We have Despair and Hex Touch right now, but in the POB, we're going to have a Despair Ring later. This is just because we're level 70 right now, and we wouldn't have that at this point. And basically this is just for bosses where you need the frenzy charges, and the on kill obviously doesn't do anything. And since we are going to be reliant on snake bites, that is just really, really huge. Basically, your frenzy charges are always at max. The Blood Rage isn't really necessary. This is just because at this point, I don't have these nodes yet. This will give you 8% of frenzy charges. Not having to run Blood Rage for me is actually really nice. I don't love the degen. And then we also have Enduring Cry and Blink Arrow. Now, Blink Arrow is our movement skill. The thing about Blink Arrow is with Withering Stab, you're actually consuming the charges of your Flame Dash, but you can still use it if you're doing Blink Arrow plus Withering Stab. Withering Stab is just really, really nice. It gives us elusive, applies at least a few stacks to enemies before the ballistas get to work. It also gives us phasing in some situations where we need it. Later, we're not going to be using a Quartz Flask. The thing we are going to do is we're going to take a single node here that gives us 10% chance to get phasing on kill. And defensively, we also have a Enduring Cry. Now, we are going to have a cast on damage taking setup with Steel Skin right here. If you look at this, it's going to be here. Cast on damage taken Steel Skin. The reason we're not doing Molten Shell is because we're not scaling armor. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later once we go into Dark Scorn. But yeah, basically, sometimes you press it, you get good life regen, and if there's enemies nearby, you also get endurance charges, which, don't forget, basically last forever with this node here. So let's show you how this plays. Right now I'm level 71. This is Blood Aqueducts. So basically what you do is you do this. As you can see here, everything kind of dies behind you. You just keep going, phasing through everything. Now, against bosses, your playstyle is obviously you have to frenzy a little bit, but overall, the big upside of one of these, I should be hitting the enemies a little bit, because then I have a Mirage Archer as well. I'm going to show you that. This is me self-casting, and now the Mirage Archer just does the work, even without me putting down any ballistas. You can see here, these just die. You can just keep moving. One of the things with poison builds in general is you just have to trust that stuff dies behind you. If you have a loot filter and something crazy drops, you'll see it anyways. Now, sometimes I can frenzy. I'll get my frenzies up to 9. Now, obviously, next patch, these will be lasting for 30 seconds, right? So I can basically fire frenzy 3 times, or I think in that case 7 times, and just forget it for the whole map. But yeah, this is basically the playstyle that you sign up for if you do this. Obviously, right now, I don't really have anything in terms of gear. This is my gear. It's super, super basic. This is also on 2 4-links. So yeah, I think this will, with all the new tools that we get, completely scale out of control. Now, next up, let's talk about items. So number one thing I want to say here is that I'm aware that there's a lot of uniques in here, and as I said in the disclaimer, it can get rough depending on how they rework uniques. That's one of the problems with this build, but I do have a set of gear that does not rely on that. Now, Goal is basically just there to get a little bit of shrines, but as you can see, it doesn't really do anything in POB. It's not like I have like the shrines ticked or something, so this is basically just a vanilla helmet for this sake. But if you can get a Goal, that's nice. If you can't, whatever. Snake bites should be extremely easy to get, and Rain of Splinters is maybe like, I don't know, 20, 30 chaos at most. Everything else here is just rare gear. So I'll just get through this one by one, and we're going to talk about early and end game. Number one, the bow. Literally all I did here is you can get this with Reforge Harvest Chaos, right? Reforge Chaos. You can get this. You can also get chaos damage on an essence. This is nothing. There is nothing on here. It's just that essence applied or that Reforge applied and a crafted attack speed. That is just how decent this build is, even on absolutely no gear whatsoever. You can also use Lioness Glare, which is really, really nice for gearing because you get hits can't be evaded. The Far Shot doesn't do anything because we're not hit-based. It has decent physical damage. It has hits can't be evaded, so you don't need any accuracy, which might alleviate a little bit of your gearing. And at the end of the day, it's very, as you can see down here, it is extremely similar in damage to just this bow. So that's why Lionize is nice. It's a comfy pick, but just making a bow like this for the start would be enough. We then have a quiver. You can go for Pierce. Pierce is pretty nice for the build, or you can go for a Vile Quiver with the physical as extra chaos. The Goal, you can basically replace this with a rare helmet right here. If you have the helmet chant, that's nice. If you don't, you don't. I'm going to actually remove this from the early game one, don't worry. Now, the leather is basically just some life, some fire res, some spell suppression. Snake bites should be really inexpensive. If they aren't, whatever. Early, you're not going to be spec'd into frenzy charges anyways. You have the boots, which is just movement speed and some life. We have the amulet, which is a little bit of dot multi. One thing I want to point out is in early game, it is extremely important that you put chaos damage on your rings and your amulet. This makes a lot of difference because your bow is very weak. Later, once you have the Covenant here, right? The Covenant gives you level 29 added chaos damage. We'll go over that, what that means in a second, but that is completely ridiculous. At that point, you have so much base damage that this little bit on top doesn't really make a difference, but at the start, this makes heaps of difference. I actually forgot to anoint this, but basically early you will get corruption. You also have this later. The nice thing about chaos builds always is that their best corruption actually only costs 2 black oils, which means you don't have to invest anything like that. This gives you like 15% more damage or something, which is crazy. Our rings are basically just as much resistance as you can afford, a life roll, and then an open prefix for the chaos damage. If you have to fix your stuff like, for example, intelligence, we actually don't need this in this section, but you will need it later. You can just get it wherever. There's still a lot of suffixes open there. The belt is going to be there to fix your strength. As for flasks, we have a life flask, a mana flask, which is basically going to be an enduring mana flask. You probably won't need that later, but I just have it in there because I know that people always have problems with mana. Just so you know, if you slap this on, all your problems are gone. If you can alleviate the mana cost, then so be it. Then you can just remove this for a better flask. We have a jade flask here, which is nice for our evasion. We have a quicksilver, and we also have a granite. As for armor scaling, we're actually not doing armor scaling. We're going to convert physical to other types of damage, which then get reduced by resistances. But early game, we are not going to have a taste of hate. So for the time being, that little bit of armor in like white or yellow maps still makes heaps of difference. And the jewel down here, we have Rain of Splinters. Now this is in general something I want to point out. You might get weirded out by this, but I actually did not take some of the 2-point jewels. And that is because this passive tree is extremely crowded. The amount of good nodes you have for this build is outrageous. And that is also something where you might think about this as a risky build, right? There's a lot of uniques, but think about not having to buy any cluster jewels. Think about not having to buy any rare jewels whatsoever. All you need is 1 Rain of Splinters in both the end game setup and the early game setup. Now going on to the end game setup right here, we're starting off with Dark Scorn. This can get expensive, right? That's why I'm putting it in the end game section. But once you can get this, you basically found your GG bow. Theoretically, you can still craft a better rare bow, but we're in a League Start scenario. I don't think that's going to be very realistic. Now, it's not only a good damage provider, it also has some other good stats. For example, it fixes a little bit of your accuracy, which is nice, but then it also has 25% of physical damage converted to chaos damage. So what this mod means is it's very similar to, for example, physical taken as elemental, just that it takes your chaos resistance now instead. Obviously, this is not perfect gear, even though I say endgame here. This is obviously not like, we're not talking about 50x or something. So a lot of these mods are open still. You can definitely cap this, but let's just say at 62% even, right? We have that 25% times 0.62. So we basically have 15.5% reduced physical damage taken. Couple that with the Taste of Hate, which converts physical damage to elemental, and couple that with the helmet, which can get you up to 12. I think it can be 14, but one of the crafts costs a divine, so I just put the lower one in there. 12% of physical damage converted to fire and lightning as well. So a lot of the physical damage that you take, actually, you don't take. And with all those defensive measures in place, I basically didn't feel the need to actually go for determination. The problem is, if you see the pathing here, we would have to sacrifice 6 points, and the mana reservation efficiency node here, the big payoff, is not there anymore. So like 6 points, that is just absolutely crazy. I would probably lose like, I don't know. Yeah, I would lose like 20% of my damage if I did that. Plus, I would have to replace Herald of Agony. So overall, if you want to do that, sure, you can fit in determination. But I definitely thought about the fizz hit, so don't worry. And just so you know, this max hit here on the side is without Steel Skin. If I put on Steel Skin, we're looking at these numbers, which would be more like an armor character would look like, just so you know. So next up, we have the helmet, which is basically just spell suppression, fizz damage taken as. The quiver here, all that changed is that it has a little bit more mods. The cold damage doesn't really do anything. And then let's go to Covenant. So you might have noticed a big spike in damage from our early game to our end game gear, and most of that is actually Covenant. So what they did with this chest is socketed gems are supported by level 29 added chaos damage. Now let me just quickly make you understand how good this chest is. Look at the full DPS down there. We go from 9.4 to 3.5. This basically almost triples our damage. So depending on how rare this is, right now they're dropping like candy. We don't know what's going to happen next league. Just so you understand what a added chaos damage actually does at level 29 and why this is such a huge deal and why you just saw such a huge spike in damage. Look at this here, 377 to 565. That's like twice of what my endgame bow has. As a comparison, a awakened added chaos damage level 6, so you have to corrupt it, is only 195 to 293, basically half of what this gives you. So yeah, even if we're talking 5-link, this is completely insane. We can say 5-link, right? Remove the void manipulation. This is still way, way better than anything you could get. This is your best in slot body armor, period. Then we have snake bites. So per frenzy charge, this gives us increased attack speed, increased accuracy rating. It gives us a chance to poison while at maximum frenzy charges, and it gives us damage over time multiplier. Now, the only downside these have, which is usually kind of a big deal, 10% reduced frenzy charge duration per frenzy charge. Well, would you see this? It doesn't matter because we have 200% increased charge duration, which goes exactly against that. So yeah, this is just all upside. And if you can get a despair on hit on this, that's even bigger. We don't really have anything on these boots other than movement speed. The 7% movement speed is an Eldritch implicit. Now, for Emmy, all we have here is damage over time multiplier, a good life roll, a little bit of strength and intelligence to fix some stuff. And we have the corruption anoint again. Now, one ring has despair on hit, basically just to automate it, so I don't have to frenzy everything. This just has some res. Now, one of your rings, it would be very nice if you get like a chaos res base, so an amethyst ring, and then have a good chaos res roll as well. Then you put on the catalyst, and this basically caps up your chaos resistance real nicely. Now, after that, we have our belt, which is once again just a vehicle for strength and a little bit of life. If you can get increased flash charges gained or like reduced flash charges used, that is always nice to do. So as you can see here, even in our end game, we didn't really go all out. Now, in terms of flasks, the only thing that changed a little bit is the values on the flasks. Obviously, you can't really divine anymore, so I didn't make them perfect like I usually do because divines are now exalted, and yeah, it's a whole confusing mess. You also want Taste of Hate at this point because at this point enemies hit harder, so armor is less important, and stuff like physical conversion gets more important. Now let's go over gems real quick. Number one, we have Caustic Arrow, our main skill. I already talked about this, but you can either get Wither from Anomalous Caustic Arrow, or you can get it from the Caustic Arrow Helm enchant. Both are fine. You only need one of them. You don't need both, basically. Greater Volley, next up, this just gives you 4 additional projectiles. Don't do GMP, because GMP is going to spread out the projectiles. You need Greater Volley to kind of like focus in and actually get the overlaps. Then you have Deadly Elements, because we're not trying to leech, so the less hit damage doesn't matter. These are, after all, our Ballista Totems, right? Ballista Totem support, Void Manipulation, just a little bit more damage, and then we also have Unbound Ailment because we're missing a little bit of poison duration. And obviously, if you replaced all of these with Awakened versions, you would do another like 30% more damage or something, which would be huge. Now, our second Caustic Arrow setup is going to be our 6-link. I guess we can do like a 5-link. I'll just do a 5-link for the POB here, so it's a little bit more realistic. 1 6-link, 1 5-link, right? We have Caustic Arrow with Greater Volley. This time, obviously, we're self-casting, so we have Mirage Archer. Basically, you don't want to be standing there always unless you have to, like it's a really hard enemy. All you want to do is like tap once, your Mirage Archer's up for 4 seconds, move. Once it's not up anymore, you can do that again. Unbound Ailments, Deadly Ailments. All you need here is Greater Volley, Caustic Arrow, Mirage Archer, and some damage supports. Then we have our Frenzy setup, and that's basically Frenzy with faster attacks just to make it a little bit smoother. GMP just to spread it out a little bit. Sometimes if you just have one arrow, you can miss moving targets, which doesn't happen with GMP, which I think is really nice. And then we have Calling Strike on top against big bosses. As our auras, we have Grace and Herald of Agony. Now, without any mana reservation here, because we don't have Enlighten, this is the budget version. If you have a better idea than Herald of Agony, we don't really need the chance to poison because we get that from the snake bites already. But if you have any better idea than Herald of Agony, this is basically just 10% more damage. I wouldn't reserve too much mana because then it's going to be awkward because you do kind of have a big mana cost. So you want to kind of have that up. But if you have a better idea, you can definitely replace it. Grace is a must-have. As I said already, if you really want to fit in Determination, you will have to crank out 6 points here and cut Herald of Agony, so you're going to lose like 30% of your damage for just a little bit better Fizz Max hit. If you want to do that, go for it. Then we have Enduring Cry and Withering Step. Enduring Cry just gives you a little bit of regen, but most importantly, it also gives you endurance charges, which is huge. Withering Step is there to give you elusive, a little bit of less damage taken, or chance to avoid hits, I should say. It also gives a little bit of wither debuffs, which doesn't really matter because you're always applying wither stacks with your totems and they just hit always, and you get phasing, which can be very nice. Val Haste, I don't have ticked here. As you can see here, if I tick Val Haste, we get a lot of movement speed and a lot of attack speed. This one got buffed this patch, so definitely pick that one up. Maybe you can do increased duration if you want to play around with it, but I didn't have the sockets. And then we also go for Blink Arrow, and we have faster projectiles and faster attacks here just to make it a little bit smoother, just so your animation finishes quicker and you don't get stunned in midair, and the Despair is from your ring. Now a note here, if you have to, you can do Hex Touch and Despair, because you definitely want to have Despair up, right? So before you get a Despair ring, you just want to replace Culling Strike and probably faster attacks and go Hex Touch and Despair here, so you always have it up. And you can basically combine Frenzy and Despair and you don't have to click twice. Then let's talk about the passive tree. First thing that I already mentioned is I actually cut all my cluster jewels. Believe it or not, it's actually not worth on this build because a lot of these nodes are extremely strong. That being said, this is a League Start setup. So for example, if you can cap your Chaos Resistance for Darkscorn elsewhere, sure. I just thought it would be kind of unrealistic to have that many perfect stats on your gear that you can actually do that. So I took this, I took the Resistance and Ailment Protection Mastery. It also gives me a little bit more damage with Polymath because it's another unique mastery. But once you're cracking like the 30-40 Exalted mark, something like this will be much less important, and you can actually do something like, for example, a Jewel with Sleepless Sentries, which gives you Onslaught. In the end, I really tried to fit it in, and you still can if you want to, but overall, I didn't go for Onslaught in the end. I have really good move speed just without it. I also don't have Val Haste ticked. If I tick Val Haste, I'm even faster, so I just didn't feel like it was needed. Now, we are Shadow, so the start is pretty self-explanatory. Your start is actually incredibly good. We're going to talk about that in the leveling video. Now, this one is very, very late once you have your Darkscorn, because then you want to cap your Chaos Resistance as good as you can so you take less physical damage as well. We have Ghost Dance, so basically the more evasion you stack, the more energy shield we get back whenever we're hit. Then we get all the goodies, right? All the poison stuff. We cannot use Plague Bearer, so Plague Bearer value doesn't do anything. We go for Poison Duration here. We go for Poison Inflict Faster. One thing I want to mention about Poison Inflict Faster, this doesn't really increase your single target damage per se. As you can see down here, we don't have that much Poison Duration. It's just that if you have your poison duration this low, your ramp up time is not as high. And since we are not an occultist, we have no explodey, right? So the faster your poisons actually kill enemies, the better. So if all you do is bossing, you can definitely cut this, right? Now then we have our first +1 totem from Watchtowers, makes us have 4 totems, and then the 5th totem comes in from Panopticon right here. Anything else special about this? We take the spell suppression. So these nodes have been buffed. These now give 8% per, and then this one gives 15%. Absolutely ridiculous. And then we get another 12% to suppress from boots, helmet, and gloves. If they have evasion, this is something you should definitely look out for. You probably want evasion energy shield bases. Most likely, I don't have this in my POB right now. That's why I only have 700 energy shield. I'm going to adjust that. Now, one bow mastery that's really important is the 20% AoE. You don't really need it for overlaps, but it's so nice for clear, and you're definitely going to see the difference. Hunter's Gambit overall, just incredibly strong. I would love to go here to Revenge of the Hunted. We simply don't have the points, and you can already see why I had to cut my cluster jewels there. Now, we don't go for this Frenzy Charge here, but we do go for this Frenzy Charge here, and that's because the Traveling node gives 4% increased evasion per Frenzy Charge, which is very nice. These nodes here also got buffed. Intuition gives now 8% spell suppress. Quick Step now gives 10%. These nodes are absolute premium now. Now, this is one thing you could cut, right? So this is probably going to be the thing if you're, for example, only level 92, you would cut that. But overall, still really, really strong. Heart of Oak gives you a little bit of stun protection, which you don't really need because you have so much evasion, but whatever. Important here as well is the Claw Cluster. I always get asked about this. Why do you use a Claw Cluster if you're a bow build? The reason is, number one, the chance to poison here is global. That's not just for claws. The poison duration here is global. also not just for claws. The damage over time multiplier here is global. And the biggest thing here is you get the claw mastery, which is one of the craziest masteries in the game. Enemies poisoned by you cannot deal critical strikes. So this single mastery basically invalidates all the crit mods you see on maps, for example, all the monsters with innate high crit. So this is an absolute no-brainer in my opinion. Other than that, we have the plus 100 accuracy per green socket on your equipped bow, which basically means you want to put the setup in there that has more green sockets. We take just this 1 pointer to give us 10% chance to gain phasing, a little bit of evasion. Now the phasing is basically always up. 10% is good enough for that. We take a little bit of skill effect duration and duration ailment. Duration ailment alone is really strong, but on top of that, the increased skill effect duration also helps. For example, stuff like Wither or the Val Haste. Do not take this here before you have the snake bites. Until then, you don't really want a frenzy stack. There's no reason to. I would take the cannot be ignited and maximum endurance charges, but whatever floats your boat. You can also take the one that gives you increased damage. I just think not being ignited is really nice. And then obviously this one here is just a no-brainer. Surveillance, Panopticon. Some people actually don't take Ironwood because it's not a PoB thing, right? You don't get any damage. But what I can tell you from experience, if you don't have these 2 points, your ballistas are going to get shredded, completely destroyed. You need the LA res, and it also gives you a little bit of armor per totem. Now, when it comes to leveling, the thing about Shadows is they have Poisonous Concoction at level 12. However you get to level 12 doesn't matter. Once you're level 12, you're basically off to the races because you can use Poisonous Concoction. And what I'm going to do for my leveling guide, which is going to be a separate video where I go through level 1 to 38, where you pick the gems and show you everything you need to know, is basically we're going to go Poisonous Concoction until maps. Trust me, I love going with my main skill early, and you still can if you want to at like level 38, but this skill is too good to not just tell you to run it. It is completely ridiculous. So if you want to have the most comfy leveling experience ever, just wait for that video. I will basically just lay it out for you. Also, the note section, if you watch this early, will not be updated, but it will be updated whenever the league releases. So you can also look at that in the PoB. Now, some of you might have the question, why do I go with Caustic Arrow? I already answered that, but why am I not going Scourge Arrow or Tornado Shot? So to answer Scourge Arrow, I'll just have to basically show you, and this revolves around just not having that good of gear. And Scourge Arrow is extremely slow on a Ballista. It charges a long ass time, and that is because Ballista Totem support has innately 50% less attack speed. That's not reduced, that is less. So whatever you have, that's cut in half. So this is how the Caustic Arrow looks like. This is why I like it. I think at League Start, comfiness is just a really big thing for me. It's not always just about what's the fastest, it's also just having a really cozy League Start experience, at least for me. And this just looks a lot cozier than waiting around for Scourge Arrow to fire. Once again, I think that Scourge Arrow is still a really, really good contender once you have all the gear going. And then let's quickly talk about Tornado Shot, which is definitely a contender for this. I actually like it a lot more than Scourge Arrow at the start, but if you remove it right here, let's remove the Caustic Arrow and let's add the Tornado Shot. Basically, Tornado Shot has a problem that it needs too many stats to function. Number one, there is no chance that you just get away with not having Pierce. You need Pierce. So let's just, for example, remove these right here and let's put them into the Pierce, right? So you get 1 Pierce here, 2 Pierce here. We can maybe put a little bit of projectile speed because that's the next problem. You don't really have enough projectile speed. One of the problems with Poison Tornado Shot in general is all the projectile speed nodes give you projectile damage, and projectile damage does not scale your poison. So you're disincentivized from actually taking all of these projectile damage nodes. It's the same thing here. These don't scale your poison, so it's just kind of awkward to scale. The best you can do is get it on your quiver, which we don't have right now. And that is just another thing that you have to gear into at League Start, something you have to think about. On top of that, the clear just isn't that great without that big fancy helm enchant that gives you an additional secondary projectile. But once again, this is something that you can revisit Endgame and actually look if you like. Let's quickly give you a show of how it looks after leveling. So I put it in. I have GMP on top. We have to, yeah, we basically have it. So this is now Tornado Shot Ballistas, and as you will see, even without that much projectile speed, it still looks pretty decent, right? Its damage is a little bit lacking because you don't have that helm enchant. But overall, this can be made work with enough gear. The problem is, guess who else wants Tornado Shot gear? All the Tornado Shot Andies that absolutely love this skill. As you can see here, you have no chain, no nothing. So that's just kind of a problem. Whereas a skill like Caustic Arrow that just has an AoE straight up, does not have any of these unique problems. But overall, what are my conclusions on this build? The number one thing I love about Totems in general, but also about this build, obviously, it's absolutely brain-dead mapping gameplay. There is so much to focus on at League Start, your Atlas progression, picking up stuff, what's happening with the new league mechanic, that I don't want to stress all the time what I have to do with my mechanics. I don't want to know, okay, I have to shoot there, I have to shoot there. League Start for me has to be a very chill experience, and that's why I love these kind of builds. So this being brain dead for me is an upside. Obviously later you're gonna chain more and more abilities to do more and more damage, but overall your core gameplay is just putting down ballistas, moving, picking up stuff. Also, you have a safe playstyle. 70 to 80% of your damage comes from your ballistas, so if you don't have time to damage and you just have to like get out of the way, guess what? Other builds have 0 damage uptime. You still have like 80% of your damage. Number 2, you can go armor if you want. It will cost you around 30% of your damage. We have a ton of evasion with Ghost Shrouds, but overall, we have all the new tools with physical converted to chaos, converted to elemental. So a lot of the physical damage never really happens, so that's why I felt like armor isn't really worth it. Also, just straight up losing the mana reservation mastery here means that it's not really worth just ghetto pathing here for no reason. So it just didn't make really sense in the whole picture, but you can still go determination if you want to. You would just take a big loss in terms of damage. If you're hardcore, there's no question you have to go armor, but if you're in softcore, I think it's totally fine, especially since you also have the new Trickster, which also gives you Heartstopper, which while conditional, whenever it's up, is basically a double as effective Fortify. And don't forget that your endurance charges are always up because you have all the charge duration. Next up, if Covenant is not too expensive, this build is completely absurd. I mean, straight up, I showed you the early game POB here with like 2 mil DPS, which is very nice for like yellow maps, right? Then you get into red maps, and then at some point you upgrade. But if, for example, Covenant is easily accessible, we're talking yellow maps with a Covenant, we're like 5 mil DPS. It's completely obscene. So depending on how expensive this item is going to be, is going to determine when you get your big power spike, which obviously also bears a certain risk. If you want no risks, go EA Ballista. It's still really, really good. Whenever they're reworking your neeks, they rework how they are tiered, how they're dropped, how much they drop. It is obviously a little scary. If you just want a super safe, no stress, then you can also still go EA Ballista. My guide is updated. I will link it down in the description if you really want to. Overall, I'm really, really hyped about this build. I already played this once before, and now is the time to put it out of the workshop and just improve upon it, and that's what we did here. I'm really excited about this League Start. I hope you are as well. But no matter what build you play, whether it's one of mine, whether it's EA Ballista, whether it's this, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, all that matters is that you have fun. Don't stress yourself out about the first few days. Just go in with a build that you feel comfortable with. Don't really think about the meta. And yeah, I wish you a great League Start regardless, and see ya. But that's it for the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe. As always, a huge shout out to my Twitch subscribers and my Patreons. I couldn't do videos like this without you. Thank you so much for the support. And yeah, League is releasing soon. I'm getting more and more hyped. I gotta say, over the last 2 streams over on twitch.tv/Palsteron, we've been kind of honing in on what we want to do, and I gotta say that I really like what this turned out. If you haven't already seen the leveling video, it's probably already out whenever you watch this, or it isn't, just wait for it. But yeah, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.